Thank you. So yeah, we talk about a recent work deposited in the archive about 2 months earlier, which is a joint work with José Antonio Carrillo, my postdoc supervisor in Oxford, and Susano Solem, who is the chairman today. And it's about modeling grid cells. I don't know if you heard of grid cells, because they make some noise this time. To make a player for you, sorry. So grid cells are a specific type of neurons that you can find in the entorhinal cortex, which is a part of the temporal lobe, so in the bottom part of the brain. And they are believed to be pivotal in helping mammals orientate in physical space. So basically, they function as part of the positioning system in the brain of many mammals. They were found in rodents, bats, monkeys, and also humans. They were discovered in Norway around like beginning of the millennium. And the way they seem to perform is that the animal can integrate information from the firing of the grid cells, and the firing is dependent on the spatial position. So you can see, for example, on the left, the square is a physical space. The black path is the real-life trajectory of a real-life rat. And the red on the path, along the path, is one specific grid cells chosen at random, firing. So when it's red, the cell is intensely firing. And you can see that it fires at specific location in space. And if you draw it, and it's a right picture, the autocorrelogram of this cell, so which is when it's correlated to itself, you can see that the firing of one of these cells, of those cells, pave the space in the hexagonal way. So you have this very characteristic hexagonal pattern. So this is one cell, and the red parts are where it fires the most, and the blue parts where it's more quiet. And it's a very strange phenomenon, and a good way to try to understand that is to proceed via continuum dynamics, first with stochastic processes and then partial differential equations, to try to have a global picture of how those cells could interact to produce those characteristic patterns. And there are evidence, for example, this paper recently published in Nature, Gardner et al., that the connectivity of grid cells could be a torus, so a two-dimensional torus for rats, for example. And so it's not sure, like you have a lot of controversy, and so it's a very active field of research, but it's a nice hypothesis to test. Assume the grid cells are connected in a toroidal fashion, and let's see if we can reproduce this activity. So a PD system was derived through the mean field limit of a particle systems by José Antonio Carrillo, Andrea Clini, and Susano Solem. So it's a paper already on the archive, and Carrillo, Holden, and Solem published a second paper which studies this PD system. And what this system describes is the probability density at each time, at each location, of finding a neuron, which neuronal activity is S. The neuronal activity being a kind of firing rate, the number of spikes per second. So it's the active frequency of the firing for the cells. And this model reproduces very well this hexagonal firing pattern. So you can see the gray line in the middle of the picture. The gray line is the real-life path of the real-life rat, but this time the red along the path is not the real-life firing of a neuron in the rat, but the prediction of the model of the firing of this green neuron. So it's tiny. I don't know if you see it well, but on the left, you have a square. So this is not physical space. On the left, it's the neurons arranged in a torus. So you have periodic boundary conditions. And you take one at random, for example, in the middle, and you see when it's firing. So when the rat moves, this pattern in the left moves, and the neuron, the green neuron, fires, like goes from the red to the blue part and fires differently. So I can try to share a GIF to show you how it can look like when the rat is firing. Where is the no? I want to. Sorry. I share. Yeah, this. Can you see the animation? Yeah. So you can see the rat moves. The firing pattern in space. So each point in space contains a lot of neurons. So you can see it either on a square or projected on a torus. And the point in the middle goes from firing very low firing when it's in a blue part, and when it moves, it goes into a red part and it fires more. And so you can see the animal can orientate itself by integrating how many like red dots it crosses. And so it means I have crossed that many like physical space distance. So you have, if you link it to other parts of the brains with integration processes, it makes sense that you can try to orientate yourself this way. So now let's see what this model looks like and how you can, how you can do some math on it. So plain screen, yeah. So the model contains four directions because you have different neurons with orientation preference, and to simplify, we consider only the cardinal points: north, south, east, west. And you have a Fokker-Planck type equations akin to the one proposed by Delphine-Salor and Xuandu in the two previous talks. Just this type, we do not consider voltage, but activity of the neurons. And so we don't have exactly the same structure. To have derivative in time of the density, a shift, and the noise, which is with strength sigma. And this red strength of the noise sigma is will be very important in our analysis. So it's driven by a firing rate, which is space dependent and acts through a convolution. So you have these W beta, four of them, which are the connectivity kernel, and each of them is in the preferred difference. So north, south, east, west. So basically you have integration of all the points through a convolution and all of the four directions through a sum, and then you input it into the drift for the activity. And the input of the rat is in this b beta of t. So basically the movement of the head of the rat and its speed are contained into the external function b of t in this part. And then the red part here is the average of the activity, which means that the model, like the convolution is not for each S, it's you look at the average activity at other points, which makes sense, like where you have connections between locations in the grid cell module, and you in each point see the averages of activity at each other point. And then you have a non-local boundary condition to ensure that the activity doesn't become negative, which wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. And the system is a little bit complicated. So what we will do to perform mathematical analysis is to simplify it to only one direction. And you can check on our paper on the archive that, in fact, you can generalize the mathematical analysis for one direction to four directions without a lot more computations. So the strategy to try to identify this specific hexagonal firing pattern is to vary the noise parameter. You can see here in the previous study by Carrillo, Holden, and Solem that when you change the noise parameter, you lose the hexagonal shape. Like when sigma reaches 0.02, you have almost lost the specific pattern that helps the animal orientate in space. But you can see that if you just change a little bit the noise, it's kind of robust. So what we expect that there is a critical value of the noise parameter, which make the pattern disappear completely, and then the only stationary state of the equation becomes a flat state, like flat in space, all neurons do the same. And when the noise goes below some threshold, a bifurcation threshold, then you have a non-constant stationary state appearing. And so it's a strategy we will employ to prove the existence of a non-constant stationary state, so patterned activity, and then try to see if the method yields some information about what this patterned activity look like and how can we relate it to these hexagons. So as I told you, let's consider this simpler one component model. So we remove the 4 directions, just one, all the neurons are the same, they are connected still through the convolution and the average. So your firing rate in purple here is connected to all of our neurons, like is a sum of the activity of the whole network, but it's different at each point. And you have still the nonlinear boundary condition. And if you solve the equation for stationary states, you can see that it simplifies to this thanks to the boundary condition. Then you can integrate this ODE because this phi does not depend on S thanks to the average. And so you see that stationary states satisfy this fixed point function. There are zeros of this fixed point functional, where this Z, thanks to mass conservation of the equation, must be this quantity. So then you have a functional, and you are reduced to found the zeros of this functional. And the problem is that it's still a little bit difficult because you have 2 variables, S and X. So you can simplify it by averaging this functional, because you can see that this phi rho bar depends only on the average rho bar. So if you multiply by S and integrate, you get a fixed point only in terms of one variable X. So let's introduce for convenience this k pi equals 1 over sigma. It's to avoid like nasty derivatives of the type 1 over sigma squared. Write this fixed point functional for the average of the stationary state. Okay. And so now we have this functional. We want some proper functional analysis framework to try to study it. So first, we consider average negative connectivity kernel. And for these kernels, you always have a unique stationary state, which is constant in space. So it will be our flat state, the standard space. It depends on the noise, on 1 over the noise. But you can build a lot of estimates with some effort about it. And we will try to prove that you have a bifurcating branch from this state. You can see that we have to define the firing rate associated to the stationary state and its derivatives. Then you specify the space in which you want to work. And why this subset of L2? Because you may guess that if you have a stationary state which is non-constant, each translation of it is still a stationary state because the equation is translation invariant. So you want to fix the center basically. So you say I want only component-wise symmetric functions. So instead of a continuum of stationary states, you have only 2, 1 and the antipodal like transformation of it. And then we have this Hilbert basis of this L2S space of the torus, which contains only cosines because the sines are not present in this one. And the Fourier coefficients, of course, which will play a major role in our analysis. And now we want to apply this ugly theorem. So don't dive into it too much, just you have 2 hypotheses, like the kernel of the Fréchet derivative of the functional is 1-dimensional, and the vector that supports it, if you apply the cross derivative, like in rho bar kappa, it doesn't belong to the image of the rho bar derivative. So you have 2 conditions, and if you satisfy them, you have the nice conclusion, which is from the trivial branch. So here in the theorem, we assume that the trivial branch is 0, so we will rescale to obtain that. The trivial branch bifurcates, and you have a non-constant branch of stationary states that are solutions to the functional equals 0. And in the neighborhood of the bifurcating point, it's the only possible solution. So of course, the only possible solution in the space L2S, which is why you can expect that then you have other solutions in L2, which are the translations of it and perhaps other things. So to apply this, we have to compute the rho bar derivative, so Fréchet derivative of the functional, which describes the stationary state, and with quite a lot of work. So you can see the dog is crying because you have to go through a lot of pain to compute and simplify the terms, and this is the computation adverse dog like me. But you may end up with this naive formulation with here this phi prime 0, which is the modulation function phi applied to the constant stationary state, 1 minus something that depends only on the constant stationary state, the constant stationary state firing rate, and the noise parameter. And here you have this convolution of W with a test function, H1 in L2S. Then you define this functional to rescale in order to satisfy the hypothesis of the Crandall-Rabinowitz theorem to have a trivial stationary state at 0. So you can see that if rho bar equals 0, you are a 0 of H for each kappa. And then you have the cross derivative, which is a nightmare and which is most of the work, but it's not very interesting. Like it contains no deep information. It's just you have to ensure that the condition, the second order condition hold to apply the theorem. But the most interesting part is a blue part. So all the information in this is in this blue part, because what you want is a one-dimensional kernel for the first order rho bar derivative. And to achieve that, you can notice that if you diagonalize this operator by taking H1, one of the elements of the Hilbert basis of the cosines, then you get a Fourier mode of W times this blue thing. So it gives you this, that if 1 over the blue part is equal to a Fourier mode, so a positive Fourier mode, because one of the parts can be proved to be positive, and the theta of k star is just a renormalization factor to ensure that the cosine thing is of norm 1. Then you can prove that you have a bifurcation. So a curve of non-trivial stationary states, curve depending on the noise. And you have additional information given by bifurcation theory that close to the bifurcation point, your non-constant stationary states, so your pattern activity, looks like the Fourier mode that supports the bifurcation. And you may want to know that this condition happens. So you can see that the blue curve is the blue part, and the horizontal lines are the Fourier modes, the renormalized, Fourier modes divided by the renormalization factor. And you can see you have multiple crossing, each crossing yielding a bifurcation if the kernel is of dimension 1. In some cases, through symmetry arguments, you can handle kernels of higher dimension by quotienting more the space. But basically, you can consider some of the first Fourier modes, so in the top part. So this part is not interesting. This part is more interesting, that some of the first Fourier modes, so 4-1, 1-4, and 3-3, yield this nice figure. And it makes sense because it makes sense to sum them, because for other type of systems, it has been proved that you can have resonance of the first bifurcations that combines into new stationary states that contains information from all of them. And if you look at this time evolution of the system from a constant state, which is unstable for small enough noise, you can see that the fourth panel in the bottom left part looks a lot like this. In fact, it's very close in spirit. And the dynamics spend some time here before going to the hexagonal pattern. And another nice thing is that if you take this cosine thing and you add the sines, which are not in L2S, so we cannot obtain something that contains them, then you have the hexagons. So it indicates, and it could be like further work, that you may be able to obtain the hexagons either by considering a larger space and performing a more complex bifurcation analysis, or by finding a symmetry breaking bifurcation that goes from there to the hexagonal pattern. And then we have yet to explain why this pattern is more stable and how, when you input the trajectory of the rats, you get it moves around without being destroyed. So some kind of stability with respect to a change in the external input. And I will finish with this more complex bifurcation, numerical bifurcation analysis in the paper by Carrillo, Holden, and Solem, where you can see that probably the phase transition here, the first one, is discontinuous. The red dot on the horizontal line being the loss of linear stability, which coincides with the first bifurcation. And you can see that you have non-constant stationary states appearing for the nonlinear model way before the first bifurcation, when the noise decreases. So probably you have some like subcritical bifurcation here, and then it connects here, and we don't see this. So we have to redo this kind of numerical simulations in a way more careful way to try to capture the unstable branches and to complete the picture, both numerically and analytically. So for the perspectives, we are working already on well-posedness and long-time asymptotics for the time evolution problem. And we have to better understand the formation stability of the hexagons, have a better bifurcation diagram, study discontinuous but fast transitions. We can be very hard when you don't have an energy structure like a gradient flow or something that helps you, and put back the time-dependent B of t, or coupling with other type of neurons that are involved in this process. Thank you very much.